Okay, I think we're going to get this underway today. Thank you, first of all, to everybody who's been logging on and also to the audience who's joining us in person. My name is James Robson. I'm the Victor and William Fung Director of the Harvard Asia Center. And on behalf of everyone at the Asia Center, I'd like to welcome everyone to the 16th Tsai Lecture and also the culminating talk of our newly inaugurated Philippine lecture series, which will continue into the next year. First, just a few quick notes about the details of the format. Since this is a hybrid event with some people in the room, if you're in the room and wish to ask a question, then you can please raise your hand and wait for a microphone to arrive before speaking so that people online will be able to hear you and your question. And this is a webinar, and so for those who are logged on remotely, you can either use the Q&A function on Zoom to type your question in, or you can use the raise hand function, and I will call on you, and then you will be unmuted and allowed to ask your question orally. And thanks to everybody for your understanding as we try to work out this new format of working in a hybrid fashion, which is probably going to be something that's around for a while yet, given the nature of the pandemic. And let me first also just thank all of the Asia Center staff for their work in setting this up, particularly Tenzin Nodop, who has done a lot of the work trying to get all the technology straight. So thank you very much. For those who are in the room, please stay around afterwards. There will be a reception to follow the event out in the concourse outside of this room, and we wish you could join us as well, Maria, for that. But here we are. So before introducing Maria Ressa, I'd like to first give a short background on the Tsai Lecture in its history. The Tsai Lecture series was established in 2000 with a generous endowment from Felix Tsai, which allows the Asia Center to bring to Harvard notable leaders in academia, government, and business, as well as other professions. The annual lecture is open to the public, and it offers perspectives from a range of disciplines and from different regions in Asia. Past speakers have included the late Surin Pitsuwan, the former Secretary General of ASEAN, the Pritzker Prize-winning architect and humanitarian Shigeru Ban, the internationally renowned human rights lawyer and advocate Asma Jahingar, the award-winning author Amitav Ghosh, Dr. Jim Yong Kim, the former head of the World Bank, and the Honorable Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister of Australia, and the Honorable Carolyn Kennedy. The Honorable Kathleen Stephen delivered the 15th Tsai Lecture in November of 2019, and then we've been unable to have a Tsai Lecture in 2020 and 2021 due to the pandemic. So we're really excited to be able to now host this lecture again this year. So it now gives me great pleasure to introduce the 16th Tsai Lecturer, Maria Ressa, who is not a stranger to Harvard or to the Asia Center. In fact, the Asia Center co-sponsored a talk with the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard just prior to the pandemic lockdown in March of 2020. I was originally going to say that this is a fitting lecture to begin our transition back to in-person events, but unfortunately the pandemic still rages on. More recently, in November of 2021, she also delivered the Salant Lecture on freedom of the press at a time when she was finishing a visiting fellowship and was affiliated with both the Shorenstein Center on Media Politics and Public Policy and the Center for Public Leadership. Now, Maria Ressa is the CEO of Rappler. She's a journalist, an author, a freedom advocate, and of course, the 2021 Nobel Peace Prize winner. It's perhaps timely to also note that that award was shared with the Russian journalist Dmitry Muratov, the founder and editor-in-chief of the independent newspaper Novaya Gazeta. And their work was cited by the Nobel Committee, quote, for their efforts to safeguard freedom of press, which is a precondition for democracy and lasting peace, end of quote. In the announcement, the committee noted that the pair represented journalists around the world engaged in the fight to speak freely despite increasingly adverse conditions for both democracy and freedom of the press, a fight that appears not to be ending anytime soon, and as we see these issues continuing in the Philippines and also in Myanmar. It is also worthy to note that they were the first working journalists in more than 80 years to win the Nobel Peace Prize, which seems to be signaling something important for our time, I think. And not incidentally, Maria was the only female Nobel recipient this past year, which is worth noting. Maria Ressa has been a journalist in Asia for 35 years and as a co-founder of Rappler, which is the top digital-only news site that is leading the fight to press freedom in the Philippines. For her courage and work on disinformation, Maria Ressa was named the Time Magazine's 2018 Person of the Year, was among its 100 most influential people of 2019, and has also been named one of Time's most influential women of the century. She's also part of BBC's 100 Most Inspiring and Influential Women of 2019 and Prospect Magazine's World's Top 50 Thinkers. In 2020, she received the Journalist of the Year Award, the John Abushan Press Freedom Award, and the Most Resilient Journalist Award. Before founding Rappler, Maria focused on investigating terrorism in Southeast Asia. She opened and ran CNN's Manila Bureau for nearly a decade before opening the network's Jakarta Bureau, which she ran from 1995 to 2005. And she's the author of two books, Seeds of Terror, an eyewitness account of Al-Qaeda's newest center of operations in Southeast Asia, and also From Bin Laden to Facebook, 10 Days of Abduction, 10 Days of Terrorism. And now clearly is shifting her focus to a new type of war, which is related to disinformation. So we at the Asia Center are deeply honored that Maria has accepted our invitation to deliver the Tsai Lecture. So please join me in welcoming Maria Ressa for today's 16th Tsai Lecture, which will actually be more of a Tsai conversation, which we thought seemed more amenable to the Zoom format. So welcome, Maria, and I wish we could be in person and welcome you back to the Harvard campus for this conversation, and hope that that will happen in the not too distant future to invite you back here. So please, thank you again for joining us.
No, thanks for having me and for having this conversation.
Great. So I thought that we would begin the conversation just with, start with some of the broader issues and then perhaps dig down into some of the more particularities of significant issues that you work on. And I thought that we could begin with the largest question, and namely that is what your thoughts are on the future of the Philippines under the newly elected administration. I mean, I guess we should have probably done a quick revision to the title of this lecture, which was The Future of the Philippines in a Post-Duterte Era, since we're not quite in a post-Duterte era now that we have Sara Duterte elected as VP. So what are some of the things that you are particularly interested in keeping an eye on as this new administration comes into power? And we learned so little of substance about Bongbong Marcos's platform or his plans during the campaign. So any general reflections you have on the election and the future as the Philippines moves forward?
I mean, so many, and I'll try to just pull out two or three strands, and then let's tear it apart, because I think that what's happened in the Philippines, frankly, is not just a harbinger; it is a bellwether of what is going to happen, what may happen in elections. We have more than 30 elections happening this year all around the world, right? And I don't know if you saw the Nobel Lecture, one of the things I did warn about there is that given that we don't have integrity of facts, meaning the social media platforms that actually deliver the news are biased against facts, it actually does not. It delivers lies laced with anger and hate over facts. So given this, if you don't have integrity of facts, how do you have integrity of elections? This was a problem we saw coming up, and with repeated information operations, right? So think about this, like if you saw the movie Inception, this is several years back, where they go into the dream world to change the real world. Well, here in our world today, it's very, very simple. Everything begins in our minds, and how you change the way we think, i.e. now repeated attacks, information operations. Some people will stop at propaganda, but propaganda online is very, very different from what we're used to. All right, so let me start with strand number one, is that we're moving deeper. The Philippines was the first domino to fall in 2016, and I'll peg it to the shift in our information ecosystem began as early as 2014. That was the annexation of Crimea. That was also the time when we saw dual realities shift, right? We began to see the possibility of what social media could do. And 2016 was really when it had been working long enough that it impacted reality. So in May of 2016, Rodrigo Duterte is elected. A little more than a month later, you had Brexit, and then you had all of the elections fall after that, including Donald Trump in November that year. You had the Catalonia elections, Jair Bolsonaro getting elected further down, right? I think beyond that, now we come to, I start saying this is the next fall, the next dominoes beginning to fall. And the Philippines, I think, is the first one. We fell further into the abyss. And this is that battle between illiberal values and democracy, illiberal systems of government, and actually having, just like in, you mentioned the last time Nobel Prize was given to journalists, which was almost 85, 86 years ago. Well, Karl von Ossietzky wasn't able to get his Nobel Prize because he languished in the Nazi concentration camp. So I think we go back to the future. I'm going to use that phrase a lot, right? We are again at this moment where there's a new technology that is shifting the way people think, that is being used to arouse passions, to arouse us emotionally. I referred to it as toxic sludge in the Nobel Lecture, where anger, hate, and conspiracy theory is what pumps out, what gets the widest distribution. And what does that do? Well, you begin to see a perfect storm where democracies at a time of complexity becomes too much and authoritarian. Anne Applebaum called it autocracy Inc. Come up, are democratically elected, shore each other up. So here we go. All right, that's like a really long way of saying this, but let me point out a few things then. So Ferdinand Marcos Jr., 36 years after his family was ousted in a people power revolt that really was kind of the beginning of these democracy movements all around the world, and going up to like 1989 when oh my gosh, Václav Havel credited the Filipino people, right? This this was the span of my career. I began to cover, how in Southeast Asia these kinds of authoritarian one-man rule shifted to democracy. Well, now we're seeing the shift back, and 36 years later, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. embracing his father, dressing like his father, using his father's song in the campaign, with a slight modernizing twist, wins 2-1, overwhelmingly over the vice presidential candidate who defeated him in 2016, right? All right, so what does that mean? I think it's a combination of different things. The first is the information ecosystem, that shift, and how it has shifted reality. Part of the reason is because one of the ways the Marcos won was I'm going to use this kind of idea of when you're sliding on ice and you're driving a car, you pump the gas and you steer into it. So that's exactly what Marcos did. He embraced his father's past. That's also what Sara Duterte did. They embraced who their parents were. And now you have the next generation coming in, 64 years old. It's an incredible twist of history, if you think about it, because before these elections, I was actually saying that whoever won these very critical presidential elections in the Philippines would determine not just our future, but also our past, right? I mean, imagine a Marcos back in power now. His father was accused of stealing 10 billion, up to 10 billion US dollars. In the last 36 years, the Philippine government has recovered less than $4 billion. Will a Marcos administration run after the Marcos family for the other $6 billion? That sounds not, well, maybe he'll surprise us. And, this is where so now what do we expect forward? Well, I'll give the one clear statement that he made, and he just made this statement on Wednesday. He's in Australia now, after the elections, before the official announcement. Ferdinand Marcos Jr. will take office at noon on June 30th, the inauguration day. When he takes office, he said that he's looking forward, and I'm gonna use the quote. He just said this Wednesday. He said that the Philippines, in talking about ties with China, is set to shift to higher gear. So it certainly looks like he's going to continue what President Duterte started by moving away from the United States. And I don't know if you remember this, but I'm going to say October of 2016, months after he took office, without telling the foreign ministry, President Duterte went to Beijing and then surprisingly announced that the Philippines was going to pivot away from the United States to China and Russia. And that was a surprise because Russia popped up out of nowhere. So here we have our new president, I guess he's president-elect, not yet, presumptive president, talking about shifting our relationship with China to a higher gear, which will have great impact in the region, because South China Sea, that's part of the Philippines' power in this way. We call it the West Philippine Sea, but this is also critical for the geopolitical power balance in the region. I'll leave it there. There's a lot more. I mean, I guess let me just point to the two themes, I think, globally that we have, and why the Philippines is a country you need to watch, because what's happening to us is coming for you. It's happened, right? And this is something I said in 2016, and I'm so sad that it did happen. But I think two things are happening globally that will impact all of us. The first is the rule of law. The old checks and balance systems of democracies are essentially shattered. And part of the reason that's happened is because the information ecosystem that now connects the world, largely driven by American companies, but now we have TikTok coming in. But part of the reason is because that has shifted the communication process. The incentive structure actually no longer allows name and shame, no longer allows accountability. In fact, rewards the opposite of it, right? You lie, you get rewarded. You attack, you get rewarded. These things were not the way it used to be. So that rule of law, the reason why I say it's connected to rule of law is it's connected to a vision of democracy in the 21st century. And the reason I say that we lack a vision for democracy is because the systems of law in the virtual world are virtually non-existent. We only live in one world. We have made the mistake that the virtual world is separate from the physical world, but we only live in one world. And part of the reason you've seen this deterioration of checks and balances and democracy globally is precisely because what changes in the virtual world, online violence, is real world violence. And we've seen that proven in the last few weeks, sadly.
Yeah, so this, I think, even though the Philippine elections weren't, I would say they weren't covered very extensively in the US media. This was kind of shocking to me, actually, how little it was covered. The one aspect that did get covered pretty extensively was kind of claims about and noticing of how Bongbong Marcos had rewritten the past and or been very successful in this attempt to rewrite the past. It seemed a little more complicated to me than simply that. And you mentioned a kind of a larger global context of reactions of a new kind of illiberalism that's taking place here. So, in your sense, I mean, did you see this 2022 election more as a kind of a return to a falsely imagined past of the earlier Marcos era, of what they sold to people as a kind of period of peace and prosperity, which we know was clearly not what actually happened there, but seemed to have been quite successfully used in this election? Or is this something else more along the lines of the illiberal movement that you just mentioned, which is to say a kind of rejection of democratic, democratic period that was inaugurated by the People Power movement of the mid 1980s, and perhaps why we're in this kind of situation then like that?
No, it's a great question, and you know what? My answer is it's a little bit of a fusion of both. This is my 36th year as a journalist. And what's so interesting to me is that every now and then, every few years, we see, I used to call it just as a nostalgia for kind of like a strongman leader, because I worked in countries that had strongman leaders, right? Like in the Philippines, we saw the nostalgia for a Marcos style leadership emerge when the family came back in 1992. And this family, grew never lost its political base, really never lost the loyalists, but they remained small in that time period. Social media allowed it to expand. But beyond the Philippines, look at Indonesia. Indonesia coming out of almost, 30 years, much more. I'm just trying to, 32 years, almost 32 years of Suharto's rule. And then you get like a new president every year for the next 4 years. And then by the fifth year, Indonesians were yearning. There was this feeling of, again, nostalgia, like it was simpler back then. Because the more things change, the harder adaptation becomes, and the more people don't want to think about it. We saw this in India in 2014. So in Indonesia and India in 2014, with the election of Narendra Modi in India, that was kind of shocking as well, because I remembered covering him in 2002 and him being accused of human rights violations in Gujarat. And then he's elected in 2014, the same year that the son-in-law of former President Suharto, Prabowo Subianto, almost wins the presidency and would have won if a social media photo of Jokowi's last rally didn't stop it, right? It was right on the verge. So anyway, I guess what I'm saying is that massive change, and you saw this also in the United States when, and I think some of this change, Barack Obama's presidency, the second time he was elected, the kinds of the gay marriage, as more change happened, as the demographics changed, the change became so people didn't quite know what to expect. And so they yearned for more stability than was it. They yearn for someone to tell them what to do so they don't have to think about it. I think that's human nature in many different parts of the world. But having said that, that's not the only thing. In the Philippines, what was also really clear is that the promise of people power, the economic promise, the trickle down effect, didn't quite trickle down. And so you have this combining together, and you add that last strand of social media, of emotional manipulation. And this is very clear, in 2019, Rappler released a 3-part series where we released the data of the disinformation networks. It was Marcos and Duterte networks combined to bolster President Duterte's ratings. I mean, there was a point in time where he had the highest popularity ratings of any leader on the planet. He had like a 92% popularity rating. But beyond that, it also burnished the image, polished the image of the Marcoses. We watched it. Our our research goes back and goes back to 2014, which was the first time we saw the seeding of these meta narratives of Marcos being turned from a pariah to a hero, of the something called the Taliano gold, mythical gold, right? This is another instance where the Marcoses, essentially the admission that there is a lot of money, and that if this Marcos wins, that money would be given back to the Filipino people. Is it true? Well, no, but on YouTube, it's true. On TikTok, it's true. On Facebook's distribution, it was true, right? And people believed it. So it's this perfect storm that played on people's emotions, changed history. We watched it in front of our eyes. I mean, we kept trying to fact check, right? Fact check in this emotion-driven social media landscape is really difficult. So this is where we are. And I don't think that we will be alone. I think you're seeing this happen. I mean, take a look at the French elections. You can see again the growth and popularity of far-right figures that take, and this is where I'll connect it with what you said, like it's illiberal, yes, but it's like the Filipinos are not saying they don't want democracy. They do. They want the right to vote. But they also don't like the way it is. It's too complex. They want someone else to take. Marcos won without laying out any real platforms. He refused to do any public debates. He refused tough questions from reporters. And what he did do is, like Bolsonaro, pushed journalists with tough questions aside and had his own vloggers, influencers, cover him up close. So it was more like, here's the man, he's having a great time. He has a son who is also running, and they are a good family. And it's all about unity. But beyond these statements, we really need to wait and see what this new presidency will look like.
Yeah. Yeah, this is, I think it's very difficult when nobody lays out a platform to then counter it. So it's a very effective, and then you recast the past. And I know, going back at least in 2019 to 2020, you were also, I think at that time noting the potential dangers and actually the actual dangers of the way that social media was functioning, but also issuing some dire warnings about the 2022 election and what that might mean. And if I recall correctly, it came down even to a possible threat to the integrity or loss of democracy itself in the face of this. The fact that if there can be no integrity of elections without integrity of facts, I think is one way that you put it. And so one question, I guess, for you is thinking back to the earlier comments and what actually happened in this 2022 election. Were there new elements that became integral to the way that social media was used by Marcos Jr. in this election that maybe weren't exactly in the same line with the way things had been done in the past and what you had predicted? Or what do we learn from this particular election cycle and the way that social media was used? If there were anything noteworthy parts of it, or was it carrying forward kind of the previous ways of using it as a tool?
It works. Disinformation works, and I think what this can show, and I think the danger for other countries, you have midterm elections coming up in November. Brazil has elections in October. Kenya has elections in August, right? The problem for every single elections, and this is the debate in the Philippines now, even internally inside Rappler, did we listen enough to the Marcos supporters, right? Did liberal media do enough stories on the Marcos supporters? I would posit, yes, we did, but some, some our debate is now that no, the media elite did not pay attention to the Marcos supporters. That's one narrative. The other narrative is that the reason why it doesn't matter whether we do 100 more stories on the Marcos supporters is because the distribution system actually is stacked against facts and journalists. And this I've said, and I've said this in Harvard, that as early as 2018, an MIT study just showed that lies laced with anger and hate spread faster and further than facts on social media. So think about that, right? If you lie, if you accuse, if you inspire hate, if you seed a conspiracy theory, you will actually spread your message further. It will get wider distribution than if you talk about nuanced facts. Okay, so that's the world we're living in. And then that's amplified on traditional media. The other thing is that when this happens, and it happens with the exponential pounding that social media does, when you say a lie a million times, it becomes a fact. So that's a methodology that started in 2014 with Crimea. You suppress and replace. Suppress one narrative, replace it with another. So we cannot tell fact from fiction. And I've said this so many times in the last 6 years, without facts, you can't have truth. Without truth, you can't have trust. Without any of these things, we have no shared reality. We can't solve problems because we can't even define them. We can't have a democracy. So that's integral to where I say there's a breakdown of rule of law. We don't have a shared space. All right. So how does it go back? I'm so sorry. I'm giving you such long answers. But I will try to give you TV sound bites. I think that the problem here now is that if the platforms that supposedly distribute the news, the world's largest distribution platform for news is Facebook. If they distribute lies over facts, this isn't going to change. And what's happened in the Philippines now is it's death by 1,000 cuts of our history. It's death by 1,000 cuts of our democracy. Madeleine Albright, in her book, the title was Fascism, right? That she really made me rethink about this. In her 2018 book, she said that, what's happening is that if you pluck a chicken a feather at a time, no one notices. It's like the death by 1,000 cuts again. That's what's been happening. And now we are at a point where it's terminal. It could be terminal, right? So, and I don't think you're talking about just the Philippines. I think we're at an existential moment for democracy. For whatever reason it is, the last spark, the last accelerant is the information ecosystem that deprives us of a shared reality. And this was the debate that we had yesterday in DC, where we were a group of activists and lawmakers from different parts of the world, from Australia, New Zealand, Christchurch call, if you remember that. What happened in Buffalo is not new, right? It has happened before repeatedly. So we had lawmakers from New Zealand, from Canada, from the EU, where they just passed the Digital Services Act, and the United States, where there's several bills that are pending right now. So it's that kind of moment. And for those of you watching, it is, I can't quantify this. What we do now will determine the quality, not just of governance. Look, I've worked under dictatorships. I've worked under Suharto. I ran the Jakarta Foreign Correspondence Club under Suharto the last year he was there. In some ways, working under a dictatorship is easier because the rules are clear. But do we really want to give up our democracy? That's where it's headed.
Yeah, and we're even caught in a perhaps even deeper catch-22 here when issues of freedom of speech then can be twisted to be used against and silence freedom of speech as well. I think this has been, something shocking to me personally, and I think also looking at where the future of journalism goes in terms of what might be called this battle for truth. You may have noticed it, but I think it was just on Wednesday morning, there was the disbanding of the disinformation governance board, part of the Homeland Security, Department of Homeland Security. And this was quite shocking. That only lasted for 3 weeks in the US and the person in charge of that, Nina Jankovic, was really brutally smeared through these online disinformation campaigns. So here, the Bureau of Disinformation, the governance board, is then having its founder then being the subject of disinformation, and how that showing just how deep disinformation works. In this kind of battle that's now going on for truth. So what is the future of journalism then in the face of this? I don't know. As you mentioned, this is a tricky one, because the more articles that you might want to write to try to disseminate that truth may not have any real specific impact. So where do you stand in thinking about this, and as a kind of a battle that we are engaged with now?
Sometimes in despair, and sometimes very, very hopeful. Well, I mean, frankly, we don't have a choice, right? We have to fight this battle. But I look, the problem now is for any journalist who questions power. You're personally attacked, especially if you're a woman. In the Philippines, women are attacked at least 10 times more than men. That's what our data shows. In Australia, Julie Inman Grant, who's in charge of some of the I guess they're what do they call that board? It's a regulatory board. She just said that women are attacked 70% more prone to attacks. So there's a personal cost to standing up to power, to asking the tough questions, to doing the stories. And I think every reporter now feels that. And what's the cost of that? In the Philippines, you can push this further away, right? There's a chilling effect. I mean, forget under Duterte, it wasn't chilling, it was Siberia. For me, I was 36 years a journalist. In less than 2 years, I got 10 arrest warrants. I've never had an arrest warrant in my life. I have a long career, but 10 arrest warrants in less than 2 years. It got to a certain point where I was like, okay, then because you need to keep doing your jobs, but the costs and the sacrifices just keep increasing. I think we need to keep doing that. And this is part of the reason I'm sure that the Nobel Committee also saw what was happening to journalists around the world. And I think Dimitri and I are just the symbols of that, because so many journalists are going through so much worse. So the costs, the sacrifice for journalism. The third part is the business model of journalism is dead. And that advertising revenue has shifted to the very platforms where the credibility of journalists, of news organizations, are being systematically torn down. It's not a coincidence that mainstream media, even that phrase, mainstream media, that trust has gone down, because we've been repeatedly targeted by information operations. Sorry about that. Let me just, so we got to keep doing our jobs. Let me respond to that with the way we think about this in Rappler, because in 2012, when we created Rappler, there were 3 pillars of Rappler. It's tech, journalism, and community. Mm-hmm. And the way I would answer your question today is I go back to those 3 pillars, because the way to fight back is through those 3 pillars. So in tech, looking for legislation, real legislation, not about content moderation, which frankly, we should move beyond that. That is the furthest downstream, right? You have to move upstream to the algorithmic amplification. Just imagine, what is an algorithm? An algorithm is opinion in code. One person, one editor repeated a million times, right? So that algorithmic amplification, that's a human being's choice, but repeated exponentially by a machine. That's the distribution system, the control system of social media. But that's not where you also stop with regulation. You go all the way up to the actual business model that has corrupted our information ecosystem. And that is what Harvard University, the professor emeritus, Shoshana Zuboff, calls surveillance capitalism. And in there, if you go up all the way upstream to that, you will see that privacy, antitrust, user safety, and content moderation, all of these things, which we look at as separate problems, they're all the same. So we need to tackle this. So the first, tech, right? Put these guardrails. Who owns your data? Do you? Or does the tech platform, after they take your atomized posts and use machine learning to build a model of you that knows you better than you know yourself, right? And use that to micro-target your weakest moment. That shouldn't be the case. So the other thing we're doing in that first pillar is we're building our own tech. We need a system. You got to fight technology with technology. We just don't have the unlimited resources of these tech platforms, but we're rolling it out. The second part is journalism. We need to keep doing our jobs, and it is thankless and it is horrendous. I could go to jail for the rest of my life. I can't knock on wood. Where's wood? But you just got to do it. I just happened to have been born at the wrong time. Became a news head at the wrong time. The other thing that I agreed to do before the Nobel Prize, was the International Fund for Public Interest Media. It's kind of a global attempt to try to help news organizations in the global South survive. And that is just surviving with money, right? And what we tried to do was to look at overseas development assistance and ask democratic governments to give more, just in these time periods. And then finally, the last pillar, the third pillar, is community. You in Harvard, you were a critical community, but communities in the Philippines, the mission statement of Rappler, my elevator pitch in 2012, is that Rappler builds communities of action, and the food we feed our communities is journalism. Well, our communities of action came in to help us. Our communities are the ones that need the facts, need journalism in order to make decisions in their lives, right? So here's the problem. When lies spread faster and further than facts, these communities are led down the wrong path. This is how you get January 6th, 2021 happen. This is how you get, and we can talk about the methodology because it's the same globally again. But I guess I'm just saying that here's the last model that I think about, right? When I think of lies, I think of like our information ecosystem as a public sphere. And in the past, news organizations were the gatekeepers there. But when tech took over as the gatekeeper, it abdicated responsibility. And I would peg that to around 2013, 2014. Now, what happened was geopolitical power, just like in the Arab Spring, after that, Egypt's government came in, right? And used it. So now here, governments have come in, intelligence agencies have come in to use these marketing tools, these advertising tools, micro-targeting. Imagine what a boon that is to an intelligence agency. I can go directly to the people, which is actually what happened in the 2016 elections in the United States. You have a 1,000-page document that shows you exactly how Russian disinformation attacked both sides of Black Lives Matter, right? And other things. So anyway, think about it like this. Geopolitical power introduces a virus of lies, repeats it a lot. That infects real people who then change the way they think about the world and the way they act in the world. Over time, so think that was 2016. Here we are in 2022. You see where the Philippines is. Where will you be after your elections.
Yeah, all the more reason. I mean, all of the different pillars that you just mentioned, and in terms of going upstream and in terms of dealing with some of the tech problems here, but also perhaps a lesson to be learned too of going downstream and really starting with education at the most fundamental lower levels. And really, one can't be start too young in terms of that. I mean, I think, talking about our position at Harvard here, and we get to educate some of the brightest students, wonderful. But also we're getting students rather late. And I think this issue of really getting down into the dealing with education is really significant here. You did raise, your own position in this, and we all know your history and the kinds of threats that you've endured, the prison, ongoing court litigation, and things like that. So if it's okay to ask maybe a slightly more private question too, which is to say, you're looking as of June 31st to a new administration coming in. What are you looking at on your own personal horizon for what that might mean in terms of your ongoing legal battles and your own work? Is there any indication that you're getting from the new administration at all, or the courts?
I don't know.
Yeah.
It's kind of like every single time I travel, I have to ask for permission from the courts that hold. I have 7 charges left. So 3 of the 10 charges have been dismissed. I still have 7 left. I have to ask for court approvals to do that. And sometimes they say yes, sometimes they say no. And I think that's part of, the breakdown of that's part of the casino-like way that the harassment continues. Having said that, look, there are 2 ways that the new president can run the government. He has a lot to prove, in the sense that he's coming in at a time when the world is recovering from COVID. It's a difficult time. He also, at this point, I would think, would want to vindicate beyond unity, beyond the phrase unity, to vindicate his family's name. So he has. I'm hoping that it would mean better governance. I always have to hope for that, right? Hopefully, rule of law, because of course he's already also stated. President Duterte is facing in an investigation by the International Criminal Court on, one of the first casualties in our battle for facts in the Philippines is we have no idea exactly how many people died in this brutal drug war, from as little as 8,000 to as much as 27,000 in the first 3 years, or just a little less than 3 years. And then we all just stopped counting because it's funny because the official numbers kept getting smaller and smaller. There was a point in August 2021 where it was 5,000, where in January 2017, it was 7,000. These are official numbers I'm quoting at you. So what's the right way to report something like that? This is the challenge. So having said that, what does that mean? At this point in time, I don't know, but I do know we'll keep doing our jobs and hope for the best. I always say that we prepare for the worst, we workflow the worst, but I don't even know what that looks like today. I will say that after, I guess early this week, Rappler had a meeting with all of our reporters, our entire company, and it's hard to figure out what kind of world we live in when you can see the shifts of history in plain sight. What's right? What's wrong? And then when you actually say something that is factual on social media, but you get attacked by torrents, do you keep doing that? At this conference yesterday in DC, academic experts, right? Experts and this woman was a health expert. She just said so many of her colleagues just chose to opt out. So what happens is that the voices that drive the public debate on social media are not the experts. And then that's amplified on traditional media. And then the experts come in, but it's like a whack-a-mole game. What kind of world are we living in if we can't even if we can't find the facts on health-related issues? These are all connected. Makes it very difficult. So folks at Harvard, please make it better. This is what we try to do, right? Oh, sorry. One last thing on what you said about education. Here's the other part that is fascinating to me, because what we have seen in the Philippines is kind of like a level of corruption in the real world and in the virtual world coming together. I hope not to bring us to the worst of times, but we've seen our textbooks over the last few years. Like we started this initiative in time for elections. It's called Facts First PH. It was a 4-layer pyramid. I talked about it at Harvard during the Tsai Lecture. It was kind of like a whole of society approach. It was successful in its way, and it has galvanized us together. It's media, news organizations at layer 1, what we call the mesh. This is civil society, NGOs, human rights organizations, environmental groups, church, business. We call it the mesh layer because they amplify the fact checks with emotions. The third layer are the research groups that tell us on a weekly basis how we were being manipulated. And the fourth layer were the legal groups, strategic and tactical litigation to protect the front lines. Well, so what was interesting is that one of the research groups showed that they went through history books in the Philippines and showed how the beginning of the shifting of history began in elementary school books, and the way it was being, like, who wrote these school books? So this is what's so fascinating to me. That alone couldn't have brought 31 million votes for Marcos Jr., right? 2-1 versus his opposition. But this combined is like, there's a phrase in Tagalog. It's like a delicacy, but it's also the way the social media info ops operate. You say a lie a million times bottom up, and then you say it top down. We call it bibingka because there's a fire in both ends. You have the fire, and here you are getting cooked in the middle. That, unfortunately, is where we are.
Yeah. I mean, this is something obviously that we see going on, not just in the Philippines, but all around the world, particularly these textbook controversies. And then it gets compounded when you have the arbiters of truth at local court level that have been put in positions that then are deciding on that. So it's a really tricky one. Maybe I can try to shift to a slightly, I know we have a number of questions that I want to get to and make sure we leave time for that, but I thought maybe perhaps a shift to maybe a slightly more optimistic kind of topic, perhaps. But this is, when we had Sheila Cornell speak a couple weeks ago in the series prior to the election, that was right at a moment when people were looking at Leni Robredor's campaign and seeing kind of an upsurge that was happening, a lot of traction that was being gained, large public events, people, a sense of optimism and all of that. So is there something, even though she lost 2-1 in the election, was there something indicative of that late kind of upsurge and what you saw, on the streets in the Philippines, and what that might also bode for the future as perhaps positive developments out of this cycle?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for bringing that up. There was something inspirational. So the two emotions that spread fastest on social media is anger and hate, right? The real negative. And the other one is inspiration, happy inspiration. It's the other end of it that spreads. And I think we saw that in Leni Robredo and in Zelensky in the Ukraine right around the same time in March. Leni Robredo started to gather, like hundreds of thousands of people started coming to her campaign rallies. And the feeling of joy and inspiration, you could see it mirrored even in her own, in the way she carried herself, right? It was right around the exact same time that Zelensky refused to leave Ukraine and inspired his own people to stay and fight for their country, despite the great sacrifices they've had to make, and now we're much further down, and he's still doing that, right? So there is this. Look at what happened. He also not only inspired Ukrainians, he also inspired the free world, right? I mean, such quick change. The question is, how do we, how will the world move from here? And I think that's the tough part of this. Leni Robredo started too late. I interviewed her during the campaign, and she was telling me how in the beginning of March she felt this passion, and she was like, this is her word. She said, I wish it had started earlier, except it's the opposite, right? She should have started earlier. And then it would have. I think the world is aching for leadership that is inspirational. And it's a tough time to be an inspirational leader. Good God, look at, where Zelensky is. So I guess, yes, it does give us hope. And I don't believe that Filipino values have changed, but I just worry that if we stay quiet, it will change, because checks and balances will not survive. And you will, as you've seen, right, the leak of Roe versus Wade, when you elect a leader who has illiberal values, who will appoint others like him, it changes at the very fabric. So this is why I think 2022, 2023 are critical years for democracies all around the world, because we've weathered 2016. And, in the United States, Joe Biden won. Many Americans breathed a sigh of relief, but it ain't over.
Indeed. Well, I think this is a good opportunity to transition to take some questions from our audience, both in person here and also virtually, if that's okay with you, Maria. We'll shift to that sure. Now. I think it'll take a minute for us to recognize those in the room, and we're going to pass mics for those. But we do have one, actually the first written comment, and also a person with their hand raised. So I think they can perhaps ask it orally themselves. That is Monty McCurchie. So feel free to ask your question, Monty, or I can read it if we don't hear your voice momentarily.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Monty McMurchie, Kennedy School alum, calling from my basement bunker in Toronto. First of all, my compliments and kudos to your moral courage. My written question stands. However, I do have one inspired by your evocative expression: education and the corrosive role that money plays in our open democratic system. The majority of peoples are living in a sense of atavistic fear, that they do not know what is going to be happening to them tomorrow. And for the politicians, once elected, relatively speaking, life is good. The prerequisites in most areas, including Canada, are good. And most politicians are loath to give up their prerequisites, which leads into being primaried and the fear of some bombastic individual. And what does that do in terms of sublimation, which makes the role and position of media absolutely more paramount. And yet we are being deluged. And how does one make a decision? And I suspect, before I conclude, it goes back to civics should start at age 1 with the family, then in kindergarten and in junior school, by being courteous to your sister, to your brother, to people that you aggregate with, and it goes on from there. But nonetheless, I applaud your moral courage. Thank you.
Good. And if you don't mind, if I can just, the written question that he had also, I actually thought was an important one that didn't get asked here. If you don't mind me, Monty, just interjecting it here, is just, do you believe the Philippine people understand or appreciate the potential civic, civil, social trauma the election of Marcos may generate? In other words, what kind of awareness, social awareness of the impact of this election do you think there is?
Oh my gosh, what a great question. So Monty, first, thank you. My gosh, there are 3 strands I'm going to pull out of that. I think the first strand is this idea of thinking fast, thinking slow, right? The Daniel Kahneman book. the things that you emphasize, education, civics, these are thinking slow processes. And yet, what is being used to manipulate us is a thinking fast process. I just don't think we have any defenses on something that actually manipulates our biology, right? The trigger is our amygdala, like just get them angry, get them, have an in group and an out group. There's an us against them. That's how we elect the populace. You get fear going, right? The worst of us, the worst of each of our, the worst of each person is this is the emergent human behavior that is being created. So this sounds really dystopian, and the reason why we're living in a dystopia is because we're creating a dystopian emergent human behavior by the information ecosystem that is connecting us, right? In the Nobel Lecture, I called it toxic sludge that is doing this to us. So that's the first step. We have to clear that toxic sludge. Otherwise, we don't have a defense against it. A journalist under attack has no defense against these online exponential attacks. I was getting at least 90 hate messages per hour. All I could do was take it. I just had to take it. And then the way I cope was by studying it, right? So anyways, that's the first. Our information ecosystem. But I said this, an atom bomb exploded. It sounds really like hyperbolic, but it isn't. This is manipulating our biologies. That's number one. Number two is you talked about civics and education. I don't know how our educational system can exist side by side with this kind of, this kind of system that is personal, that is filling us with anger, hate, conspiracy theories. So that's the second challenge. I think the third challenge that you brought up now is, in the Philippines, which is the question, do we know what it is? I think we do. Obviously, this is why Filipinos are a little bit in shock, because some people didn't expect it, but I don't know how we could not have expected it when every statistical survey was actually forecasting something like this. I did hope that it wouldn't have been by such a large margin, but it is what it is. So what do we do now? I think the key part is journalists have to keep doing our jobs. But again, I go back to you, if we don't fix the social media platforms, the entire incentive structure of everything in our society is turned upside down. We still think that they're separate, but the incentive structure of the internet, of social media, what does it incentivize? It incentivizes lies. It incentivizes the worst journalism, right? The reason, like, if you really wanted to get your story spread, you should just, as a news organization, we started with clickbait. But then beyond that, you've seen these in other news groups in the West as well, where they're just lies, little half-truths that are expanded, and then people clash over nothing. This is what has become the news. Now I sound so negative about everything. I guess I'm just pointing out, we need guardrails in place for the tech so that our minds can begin to work again. We need to accept that the checks and balances that we used to have are being corroded because of the lack of facts, because of a lack of shared reality. And then finally, that means we need to, as humanity, decide, are we good, or are we going to help create the worst of who we are? Are we going to allow emergent human behavior to be determined by the toxic sludge?
Great. In fact, the next question is very much, let me see, I can't see behind me if there's any questions in the room. If so, please just raise your hand and request a mic. And I know Enzo, so why don't, while the mic is getting there, I'll take one more question here and then be ready to go, Enzo, okay? So we also have another person listening, or that's logged in online, Hugh Lester, who has also raised his hand, so I'm assuming he is able to ask his question live then too. So we'll unmute you. Hello? If not, I'll ask the question.
Hello. Yes, it's Hugh Lester.
Great.
Hi. I'm a member of Asia Society, Northern California. So my question is, how would you regulate tech companies like Facebook, TikTok, and so on to prevent the spread of misinformation and increase trust in the information on those platforms?
Thank you for the question. Oh my gosh, I wish I had a magic wand. No. Oh wow. There are many ways. So let's talk about what's possible in the real world, and then I'll talk about what I wish. I think short, medium, and long term, right? Because the short term is whether I go to jail will determine whether, if the lies don't stop, then there's no pushback against horrendous things. The weaponization of the law followed the weaponization of social media. We have a senator who's been in jail. She's starting her 6th year in jail now. Okay, so what to do? The EU just passed the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. Both of these things will probably go into effect spring next year. In principles, they've all been set. And this is the most progressive, I think, of what we have globally, because they don't stop at content moderation. They go up to the algorithmic amplification, but they don't quite touch the business model yet. So that's, you also have the UK online safety bill that is, I had testified for that as well. Canada, as you know, is also going through its own legislation. Once the EU kicks in, because of the way these social media platforms work, they do a one-size-fits-all. English, for example, the West getting preferential treatment because English is more moderated than, say, Filipino languages out in the global South. Section 230 is something that I had hoped. I said this in the Nobel Lecture: reform or revoke Section 230. And just yesterday we were talking through the two parts of Section 230. The part that does need to get reformed or revoked. The part that needs to get revoked is the one that gives impunity to these social media platforms, takes away accountability for the repeated lies, right? So I know that sounds, let me phrase it this way. The way the first part of Section 230 was set up is that they're not responsible for user-generated content. But the question is, as they become essentially the nervous system of all of the entire world, why would they not be responsible for what gets amplification? Because those are the business model, essentially, in order to keep you scrolling, they appeal to the worst of you, to the worst content. And that is a choice, like the algorithmic amplification. So reform that part, make them accountable. That would be the immediate short term for people like us in the global South, because that, I think the biggest problem, and I said this up front, right, is the level of impunity. No one has been held responsible for anything, not Russia on using information warfare against American citizens, not Facebook, not YouTube, not the platforms that allowed these things to happen. Ultimately, if you were to ask me, we have to look at the business model, because surveillance capitalism, the ownership of our data, that's something that I think the antitrust parts, all of these things go hand in hand, and they have to be, these technology must work in a democracy. They cannot subvert it. which is essentially what's happened in our information ecosystem. The reason we have a lack of rule of law is because it's been subverted at the most fundamental level. The reason I became a journalist is because I believe information is power, right? Now, to think of that power completely subverted, what's up is down and what's down is up. And the kind of ripple effect of that is why democracy is being destroyed all around the world.
Great, thank you very much, Maria. And I know that in the interest of time too, I know I was informed that you have a meeting right at 12:30. I guess maybe you don't know that, but you do. So I want to make sure that we can still get in a live question here. And so we'll turn to Vincenzo Bolletino.
Yes, thank you so much, Maria. Such a pleasure to meet you. I am Enzo Bolletino. I work with the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative and have been doing research on climate-related hazards in the Philippines for the past 8 years. I'm wondering what you see Marcos Jr.'s future looking like as it relates to the economy of the Philippines. Will an economic downturn potentially turn the tide against him? And what do you see as the future of the Philippines economy under Marcos?
Wow, you had two things that were there, like the climate change one is so critical for us because as early as 2013, the Philippines was the third most disaster-prone country globally. And one of the first things we did in Rappler was to actually build a platform for climate change, for disaster risk reduction. We were getting an average of 20 typhoons every year. So this is one of the things we haven't done very much. Climate change has, even though we're so affected by it, there's this idea that, well, it's not our fault, it's theirs. Again, that pointing fingers to instead of taking responsibility for what we can do. Your question about the economy, look, one of the things I realized right around the time Marcos was getting elected, right after Dimitri and I went to Geneva because we were doing something together, and I spoke with the Swiss government and the Swiss authorities, who reminded me that in 1986, Marcos was really the beginning of the kleptocrats, right? It was the first time that the Swiss government waived the secrecy laws and they returned money back. So what we know, let me just go with the facts, and I will give our new president hopefully a chance to change it. The $10 billion was done through a system of kleptocracy where different bank accounts were in different people's names. And as late as a few years ago, one of the Marcoses actually asked for some of their assets back, right? So this is like a kind of systemic corruption, rent seeking that goes all the way back up. Will this happen? I hope not during a pandemic. Did this happen under the Duterte administration? Well, what we do know is a Senate hearing that exposed corruption on a massive scale during our on pandemic funds, right? I mean, you would think this would not happen, but anyway, it did. So the quick answer is the challenge for the economic manager, who hasn't been named yet. This is going to be a really tough job, because if the person that becomes our new finance secretary has credibility, not just within the Philippines, but internationally, perhaps we'll see FDIs return. Perhaps we will see rule of law in contracts. If that's not the case, then that could mean worse times ahead for us. Again, I hope I want to be optimistic, but we also have to look at the track record.
Well, wonderful. Thank you. And I think ending on that word of optimism, or at least a strategy and hope going forward, is a nice way to tie things up here. I wish we could keep going. I apologize to many of those online who we weren't able to get to all of the questions. And I know we could keep talking about so many of these issues for much longer with you, Maria. Your responses have been insightful, and also addressing some of these really intractable problems that not just the Philippines is facing, but that all of us are facing around the globe right now. And the importance, as you mentioned, of just looking at what's happening in the Philippines as important for it domestically, but also as a kind of a little window onto perhaps what other governments, peoples around the world might be facing are key issues that all of us have to grapple with going forward. So we'll be looking to you. We'll be following you and your writing and your work and your ongoing and courageous battles that you're taking on. I know you've earned the respect of journalists and people around the world for the work that you've done. And I just would like to end by thanking you for taking the time. I know you need to run off and catch another meeting, and we just appreciate you fitting us in for this 16th Tsai Lecture. And I hope that we can perhaps invite you back in the future as we continue to monitor all of this. I think it's important to give a platform to get voices and knowledge out, and we would love to hopefully have you back even in person one of these days. So thank you again very much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening. I mean, you know, in the attention economy, having your attention this long in the Philippines is fantastic. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you again, and good luck with everything, okay? And thank you to all of our people who signed on online. Okay, thank you.